4 dying German Shepherd puppies lay suffocating in a burlap sack at a Detroit scrapyard, tossed aside like garbage. Ethan, a broken Navy SEAL battling PTSD, stumbled upon them. In their desperate gasps, he heard the ghosts of lost comrades. With no money but a vow that no one gets left behind, he traded his past glory to fight for their future. You must stay until the end to witness how 4 fragile souls became the iron wall that saved a warrior from his own storm. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. If you believe love can heal even the deepest wounds, hit that subscribe button right now. The slate-gray sky hung low over the rusted skeletons of the industrial district, weeping a fine, chilling mist that soaked into the bone, turning the world into a blurred watercolor of decay and silence. Ethan walked through this gloom not with a destination, but with the aimless drift of a ghost haunting its own life, his boots crunching heavily against the gravel of the roadside. At 38, Ethan was a man carved from granite and regret, a former Navy SEAL whose physical presence was as imposing as a fortress, yet as desolate as a ruin. He was tall, standing over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that seemed permanently braced for an impact that never came, but his frame had grown gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely over muscles that had once been fed by purpose but now starved on grief. His face was a map of harsh terrain, a square jaw darkened by days of neglected stubble, a nose slightly crooked from a training accident years ago, and hair the color of midnight that was rapidly surrendering to premature streaks of steel gray at the temples. But it was his eyes that held the true story, deep-set, dark brown, and possessing the 1,000-yard stare, a gaze that looked through people rather than at them, constantly scanning for threats that no longer existed while replaying horrors that would never leave. He was a man who had survived the hell of combat only to be broken by the quiet war of peace. The silence of his empty house, stripped bare of furniture to pay for his mother's failed cancer treatments, was louder to him than any mortar explosion. Since her funeral last week, the final tether anchoring him to humanity had snapped, leaving him drifting in a sea of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, where the faces of fallen comrades superimposed themselves over the strangers he passed on the street. He was known to the few neighbors left as a recluse, a man of terrifying silence who flinched at car backfires and kept his back to the wall, his kindness buried under layers of defensive armor that he no longer had the energy to remove. The wind picked up, carrying the metallic tang of rust and wet cardboard from the nearby scrapyard, a sprawling graveyard of machinery that mirrored Ethan's internal state. He paused by the chain-link fence, his breath pluming in the cold air like cigarette smoke, watching the shadows lengthen across the mounds of twisted iron. Suddenly, the grinding roar of an engine shattered his solitude. A battered, mud-caked pickup truck, its color indistinguishable under layers of filth, skidded to a halt near a towering pile of refuse about 50 yards away. The driver did not step out. Instead, a heavy arm clad in flannel reached through the window, swinging a burlap sack with violent indifference before hurling it onto a heap of jagged metal and rotting garbage. The sack landed with a sickening, soft thud, not the metallic clang of trash, but the dull, heavy sound of organic life hitting the earth. Before the dust could settle, the truck engine roared again, tires spinning in the mud as the vehicle sped away, leaving behind nothing but exhaust fumes and a silence that felt suddenly, violently heavy. Ethan stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs not with fear, but with a sudden, sharp recognition of cruelty. The soldier in him, dormant and buried under grief, twitched awake. He didn't think. He moved. His legs, trained to run through sand and fire, carried him over the broken fence and across the treacherous ground, his eyes locked on the burlap sack which was now shifting slightly, a pathetic, trembling movement against the unyielding trash. When he reached the pile, the smell of decay was overwhelming, but Ethan fell to his knees, his scarred hands tearing at the rough knot of the sack with frantic desperation. As the fabric fell away, the breath hitched in his throat, choking him with a wave of sorrow so potent it nearly brought him to the ground. Inside were 4 puppies, German shepherds, a breed known for nobility and strength, now reduced to trembling skeletons wrapped in dull, patchy fur. They were barely 2 months old, their ribs protruding like the rungs of a broken ladder, their bellies distended from malnutrition and parasites, and their skin raw with mange. They lay in a pile of misery, too weak to whimper, their breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps that sounded like the ticking of a clock winding down. Ethan stared at them, his hands hovering, afraid that even a touch might shatter their fragile existence. And then, the smallest of the litter, a male with a faint black mask and oversized ears, lifted its head. The puppy's eyes were clouded with sickness, yet they locked onto Ethan's with a piercing clarity, a desperate plea that cut through the haze of Ethan's trauma. In that split second, the scrapyard vanished and Ethan was back in the desert, holding the hand of his dying squad leader, a man who had looked at him with that same expression of fading hope and trust. The memory washed over him, visceral and agonizing, the smell of blood mixing with the smell of wet trash, but instead of paralyzing him, it ignited a fire in the cold ash of his soul. "No," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse, the single word a defiance against death itself. He remembered the code he had lived by, the only scripture that still held meaning. No man left behind. He knew the reality of his situation. His wallet was empty, his cupboards were bare, and he could barely take care of himself, let alone 4 dying creatures that required expensive medical intervention. Logic dictated he call animal control or walk away, but the soldier in him had already made the decision before his mind could catch up. He saw not just 4 sick dogs, but 4 abandoned souls who had been discarded like trash, just as he felt discarded by the world he had fought to protect. Carefully, with a tenderness that belied his rough appearance, Ethan gathered the filthy sack into his arms, pulling the shivering bodies against the warmth of his chest, shielding them from the biting wind with his own jacket. The puppies instinctively burrowed into him, seeking the heat of his skin, their faint heartbeats fluttering against his own like trapped birds. He stood up, the weight in his arms grounding him for the first time in months, giving him a center of gravity in a spinning world. He didn't know how he would save them. He didn't know where the money would come from. But as he turned his back on the scrapyard and began the long walk home, Ethan felt the crushing silence of his life crack open just enough to let a sliver of purpose shine through. He was no longer just a broken veteran waiting to die. He was a guardian on a mission, and for Ethan, the mission was everything. The heavy oak door of Ethan's neglected bungalow slammed shut, severing the connection to the gray, weeping world outside, but the silence that usually greeted him was instantly replaced by the frantic, chaotic energy of urgent survival. Ethan didn't stop to remove his wet boots or his soaked jacket. He moved with the precision of a machine reactivated after a long dormancy, striding directly into the kitchen which, like the rest of his life, was sparse, cold, and strictly functional. He cleared the clutter of unpaid bills and unopened mail from the central wooden table with a sweep of his arm, creating a makeshift operating surface, and gently lowered the burlap sack onto it. His hands, large and calloused, scarred from shrapnel and years of gripping rifles, trembled slightly not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump of a combat situation he hadn't felt in years. He hurriedly unzipped his tactical backpack, which sat in the corner like a loaded weapon, a bug-out bag he kept packed out of paranoid habit, and retrieved a military-grade first aid kit. The smell of the house, usually stale with dust and old coffee, was quickly overpowered by the sharp, stinging scent of isopropyl alcohol and the underlying, nauseating odor of rot emanating from the sack. Ethan unfurled the fabric completely, exposing the 4 tiny, shivering forms to the harsh light of the single overhead bulb. They looked less like dogs and more like broken fragments of life. Their ribs heaved in a jagged rhythm and their fur was matted with grime, engine oil, and their own filth. The soldier in Ethan took over, pushing the grieving son into the background. He began triage. He filled a basin with warm water and grabbed a clean rag, his movements efficient and devoid of wasted motion as he began to clean the first puppy, a female with a dark coat he mentally tagged as Alpha. As the warm water turned brown with dirt, he uncovered the extent of the damage: skin angry and red from mange, ticks swollen like grapes embedded in their ears, and gums pale as parchment indicating severe anemia. Ethan worked in silence, his jaw set tight, using tweezers to remove the parasites one by one, a grim task that required surgical focus. He remembered the sugar. Glucose was critical for shock. He raided his pantry, finding a half-empty bag of sugar, and mixed a warm solution, using a plastic syringe from the med kit to force tiny drops into their mouths. "Drink," he commanded softly, his voice a gravelly rumble that seemed too large for the room. "You don't get to quit. Not today." The puppies were too weak to suckle, so he had to be patient, massaging their throats to stimulate swallowing, a delicate procedure that contrasted sharply with his rugged appearance. He watched the liquid disappear, praying it would jumpstart their failing systems. It was during this process that he paid closer attention to the smallest of the litter, the one whose eyes had locked onto his in the scrapyard. This puppy, a male with oversized paws that looked comical on his emaciated frame, was fading fast. Ethan named him Bravo in his head, a tactical designation for a tactical problem. Bravo was limp, his body temperature dropping, his breathing a shallow whistle. Ethan wrapped Bravo in a thick wool towel and tucked him inside his own shirt, directly against his skin, sharing his body heat in a desperate attempt to stabilize the tiny creature. Night fell heavy and suffocating over the house, turning the windows into black mirrors reflecting Ethan's exhausted face. The initial adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a fatigue that settled deep in his marrow. He had moved the patients to a makeshift nest of blankets near the radiator in the living room, but he couldn't sleep. Sleep was the enemy. Sleep was where the faces of his dead squadmates waited in ambush. Instead, he sat on the floor, his back against the peeling wallpaper, watching the rise and fall of 4 tiny chests. The silence of the room began to warp, the ticking of the wall clock sounding like the timer on a detonator, and the shadows in the corners stretching into the shapes of insurgents. His PTSD, a predator that hunted in the quiet, began to close in. His breath hitched, his heart rate spiking as the phantom smell of burning diesel and cordite filled his nose. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping his knees, trying to ground himself. You are in Detroit. You are home. You are safe. The mantra felt like a lie, but then a sound cut through the noise in his head. A high-pitched, distressed whimper. Ethan's eyes snapped open. It was Bravo. The little puppy had crawled out of the blankets and was seizing on the hardwood floor, his tiny limbs paddling the air, his jaw clamped shut, foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. The flashback shattered instantly. Ethan lunged forward, not as a soldier fighting a memory, but as a medic fighting death. He scooped Bravo up, careful to support the seizing head, and placed him on his lap. "Stay with me, Bravo. Stay with me," he urged, his voice cracking. He checked the airway, clearing the foam with his pinky finger, and began to rub the puppy's chest vigorously to stimulate circulation. The seizure seemed to last an eternity, a terrifying span of time where Ethan felt the fragility of life vibrating in his hands. He felt helpless, a feeling he despised more than pain. He had watched men die in the sand, bleeding out while he held compression bandages, and he had promised himself never again. He poured every ounce of his will into the small animal, whispering fierce promises into the soft, twitching ear. "I didn't pull you out of the trash just to let you die on my floor. You hear me? Fight!" Slowly, agonizingly, the convulsions ceased. Bravo went limp, but he was breathing, a ragged, hitching gasp, but a breath nonetheless. Ethan didn't put him back in the nest. He sat there for the rest of the night, holding Bravo against his chest, feeling the weak, thready heartbeat against his palm. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, Ethan looked down at the sleeping puppy and then at the other three huddled together. His shirt was stained, his hands were shaking, and his eyes burned, but the ghosts were gone. They had been pushed back by the immediate, undeniable reality of these 4 lives depending on him. He realized then, as the sun crested the horizon, that the war wasn't over. The battlefield had just changed. It was no longer about taking lives, but about holding on to them with everything he had left. The morning sun bled through the grime of the kitchen window, casting a pale, unforgiving light on the aftermath of the night's battle. Ethan hadn't slept, his eyes gritty and rimmed with red, but the frantic urgency of the previous night had settled into a grim determination. He loaded the 4 puppies into a cardboard box lined with towels, their tiny bodies still radiating a sickly heat, and carried them to his rusted pickup truck. The drive to the veterinary clinic was a blur of gray streets and potholed asphalt, the vibration of the engine masking the nervous thrumming of his own heart. He arrived at Second Chance Animal Hospital, a modest brick building with peeling paint but a clean, welcoming interior. The bell chimed softly as he entered, a sound that felt too cheerful for the weight he carried. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the head veterinarian, met him in the examination room. She was a woman in her late 50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back into a severe bun that contradicted the gentle warmth of her hazel eyes. She moved with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too much suffering but refused to stop caring. She wore a white coat that had seen better days, stained slightly with iodine near the pocket, and her hands were steady as she examined each puppy, listening to their hearts and palpating their swollen abdomens. She didn't flinch at the smell or the filth. Instead, she murmured soft, soothing sounds that seemed to calm the trembling animals. After 20 minutes of silence, she took off her stethoscope and turned to Ethan, her expression grave. "It's bad," she said, her voice rough like sandpaper. "Severe hookworm infestation, dehydration, anemia, and I suspect parvovirus in the smallest one. They need aggressive fluid therapy, blood transfusions, and round-the-clock monitoring in isolation." Ethan stood rigid, his hands clasped behind his back in a parade rest stance he couldn't shake. "Do it," he said, his voice flat. Dr. Jenkins sighed, pulling a clipboard from the counter. "I need to be honest with you, son. This level of care, it's going to be expensive. We're talking thousands, up front." She slid the estimate across the metal table. Ethan looked at the number at the bottom of the page. It was a figure that mocked his empty bank account, a number that exceeded the balance he had left after burying his mother. He swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in his throat. "I don't have it," he admitted, the shame burning his cheeks hotter than any desert sun. "Can I pay in installments?" Dr. Jenkins looked at him with sympathy, but shook her head slowly. "I wish I could, but the clinic is barely staying afloat as it is. We can't credit this much medicine." She hesitated, then added softly, "There is another option, humane euthanasia. They wouldn't suffer any more." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan looked down at the box. Bravo, the runt, lifted his head weakly, letting out a faint squeak. That sound was a command. "No," Ethan said, the single syllable hard as steel. "Keep them alive. Start the treatment. I'll get the money. I'll be back in an hour." He turned on his heel and walked out before she could see the desperation in his eyes. The drive back to his bungalow felt like a funeral procession. Ethan stormed into his house, bypassing the mess in the kitchen and heading straight for the small wooden cabinet in the living room, the only part of the house he kept meticulously dusted. It was a shrine to a life that felt like it belonged to a stranger. Behind the glass lay his history, a Purple Heart medal, a folded flag, and his collection of tactical knives. But the centerpiece was a watch case. Ethan opened it, his fingers brushing against the cool steel of a vintage Rolex Submariner. It wasn't just a watch. It was the last gift his father had given him before he deployed for the first time, a tangible connection to the man who had taught him what it meant to be strong. "Time is the only thing you can't fight, Ethan," his father had said. "Make it count." Next to it lay his K-bar combat knife, the handle worn smooth by his grip during countless patrols, the blade etched with the names of the friends he hadn't been able to bring home. These objects defined him. They were the proof that he was a warrior, a hero, a son. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the silence of the empty house pressing against his ears. He looked at the watch, then at the empty spot on the floor where Bravo had seized the night before. The choice was agonizing, tearing at the fabric of his identity. But then he closed his eyes and saw the puppy's clouded gaze. "Honor isn't in the medal," he whispered to the empty room. "It's in the mission." With a sudden, violent motion, he swept the watch and the knives into a duffel bag. He didn't look back. The pawn shop was a dim, claustrophobic space that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. Behind the counter, behind a wall of bulletproof glass, sat Mr. Henderson, a man who looked like he was carved from gristle and cynicism. He was bald, with a thick gray mustache that twitched when he spoke, and eyes that assessed value with predatory speed. He didn't look up as Ethan approached. Ethan unzipped the bag and laid the items on the counter. The heavy thud of the Rolex and the menacing glint of the K-bar drew Henderson's attention instantly. The pawnbroker picked up the watch, screwing a jeweler's loop into his eye. "Submariner. No date. Good condition," he muttered, his voice devoid of emotion. He picked up the knife, testing the edge with his thumb. "Issued?" "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "I need cash. Today." Henderson named a price. It was low, an insult to the history those items held, but it was enough to cover the vet bill. Ethan didn't haggle. He didn't have the time, and his pride was already a casualty of the day. "Deal," he said. As Henderson counted out the stack of bills, Ethan felt a strange sensation. He expected to feel hollow, stripped of his armor. Instead, as he took the money, dirty, crumpled bills that smelled of tobacco, he felt lighter. The weight of the past, the heavy burden of living up to the medals and the memories, seemed to lift slightly. He walked out of the pawn shop into the blinding daylight, his wrist bare, his pockets heavy with the means to save 4 lives. He had traded his past for their future. He got into his truck, the engine roaring to life, and drove back to the clinic, not as a Navy SEAL with a legacy to protect, but as a man with a promise to keep. The sterile white walls of the isolation ward at Second Chance Animal Hospital became Ethan's new world, a stark contrast to the chaotic grime of the scrapyard or the dusty silence of his bungalow. He had paid the deposit in cash, a thick stack of bills that smelled of the pawn shop, and watched as Dr. Jenkins and her team descended on the 4 puppies like a pit crew. They were shaved in patches to find veins that had collapsed from dehydration, hooked up to IV lines that looked like spiderwebs against their fragile bodies, and placed inside incubators that hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration. For the next 72 hours, time dissolved into a meaningless loop of beeping monitors, the hiss of oxygen, and the smell of antiseptic that burned the back of Ethan's throat. He refused to leave. He sat in a hard plastic chair in the corner of the room, his long legs cramped, his eyes rimmed with dark circles that looked like bruises. He watched the fluids drip, drop by drop, counting them as if they were seconds left on a timer. The puppies, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, as he had officially named them on the intake forms, floated in a twilight state between life and death. Alpha and Delta were showing small signs of improvement, their gums turning a shade pinker, but Bravo, the runt who had started this entire crusade, remained critical. He lay motionless, a tiny scrap of fur amidst tubes and wires, his chest rising with agonizing slowness. Ethan slept in jagged bursts, waking with a start every time a machine chirped or a shadow moved across the glass. The nurses, initially wary of the intense, silent man with the combat boots and the 1,000-yard stare, eventually softened. A young veterinary technician named Maya, a girl with bright blue hair and a compassionate smile, brought him coffee and sandwiches he didn't ask for. "You need fuel, too, soldier," she had whispered on the second night, placing a blanket over his shoulders. Ethan had nodded, unable to find the words. He wasn't used to kindness. He was used to orders and survival. But even in this medical sanctuary, the war followed him. In the quiet hours of the early morning, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors morphed into the sound of radar tracking, and the puppy's labored breathing sounded like his squadmates gasping for air in the dust of a collapsed building. He gripped the armrests of the chair until his knuckles turned white, fighting the flashbacks with the only weapon he had left: his presence. He talked to them. Low, rumbling monologues about nothing and everything. About the weather, about the oak tree in his backyard, about the best way to clean a rifle. It was his way of tethering them to the world, of letting them know they weren't alone in the dark. The crisis struck on the third night, the witching hour when hope is thinnest. The clinic was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft scratching of a pen from the nurse's station. Suddenly, the steady rhythm of Bravo's monitor shattered into a piercing, continuous wail. The flatline. The sound cut through Ethan like a sniper's bullet. He was on his feet before the alarm had finished its first cycle. Dr. Jenkins rushed in, her face pale under the fluorescent lights, stethoscope flying to Bravo's chest. She listened for a heartbeat, her eyes closing for a second, then she pulled back, shaking her head. "He's gone, Ethan." His heart stopped. "There's no electrical activity." The words were a finality, a door slamming shut. But Ethan didn't hear them. He didn't accept them. In his mind, he was back in the Humvee, watching life drain out of his best friend, helpless to stop it. Not this time. He shoved past the doctor, his movements blurring with speed. "No," he roared, a sound that shook the glass walls. "Clear the way." He reached into the incubator, his large, calloused hands encompassing the puppy's entire torso. He didn't use the gentle touch of a pet owner. He used the calculated force of a combat medic. He positioned his thumb directly over the puppy's heart, behind the elbow of the front left leg, and began chest compressions. Push, release, push, release. "Come on, Bravo, on me, stay on me," he shouted, his voice cracking with a desperation that was raw and terrifying. He wasn't shouting at a dog, he was shouting at death itself, commanding it to retreat. "You don't get to leave, that is an order." Dr. Jenkins stood frozen for a moment, stunned by the sheer ferocity of his will, before she snapped into action, grabbing a syringe of epinephrine. "Ethan, be careful. His ribs are fragile," she warned, but she didn't stop him. She injected the drug into the IV line while Ethan continued the rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. He leaned down, covering the puppy's entire muzzle with his mouth, delivering a gentle puff of air, then went back to compressions. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the sterile metal table. The monitor screamed its flatline tone, mocking him. Beep. A single, erratic spike appeared on the screen. Ethan froze. Beep, beep. The rhythm returned, weak and thready, but there. Bravo's small body jerked, a gasp of air filling his lungs, and his legs twitched. Ethan slumped against the table, his knees giving out as the adrenaline crashed. He watched the green line stabilize, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He reached out, his hand shaking uncontrollably, and brushed his thumb over Bravo's head. The puppy let out a tiny, high-pitched mew. And then, the dam broke. Ethan, the man of stone, the soldier who hadn't shed a tear at his mother's funeral or his father's wake, buried his face in his hands and wept. Great, heaving sobs tore through his chest, a release of years of accumulated grief, guilt, and trauma. He cried for the friends he couldn't save, for the mother he lost, and for the tiny life he had just snatched back from the void. Dr. Jenkins motioned for Maya to leave the room, giving him the privacy he needed. For the first time in forever, Ethan felt the ice around his heart melt. He realized, through the blur of tears, that in saving Bravo, He hadn't just performed a medical procedure. He had performed an exorcism. He had looked death in the eye and won. The return to the bungalow marked the end of the medical siege and the beginning of an occupation. 2 weeks after the flatline incident, Dr. Jenkins had signed the discharge papers with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, handing Ethan a formidable list of dietary requirements and medication schedules that looked more like a battle plan than a pet care guide. Ethan drove the squad home, the cab of his truck filled with the unfamiliar musky scent of puppy fur and the high-pitched yips of excitement. When he opened the front door, the silence that had plagued him for months didn't just retreat, it was obliterated. The 4 German Shepherd puppies, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, exploded into the living room like furry grenades, their paws scrambling for purchase on the hardwood floors, their tails acting as rudders steering them into table legs and corners. Ethan stood in the doorway, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and watched the chaos unfold. For the first time in a long time, the emptiness of the house didn't feel like a vacuum waiting to suck the life out of him. It felt like a canvas waiting to be painted. The transition from solitary recluse to platoon leader of a canine unit required a complete tactical restructuring of Ethan's life. The mornings of staring blankly at the ceiling until noon were gone, replaced by the 0500 wake-up call, a wet, sandpaper tongue applied directly to his nose by Bravo. Bravo, the runt who had defied death, had developed a clinginess that bordered on symbiotic. He slept curled into the crook of Ethan's knees and shadowed his every step, his large, bat-like ears swiveling like radar dishes to track Ethan's movements. Ethan, still gaunt but with a newfound alertness in his posture, found himself falling back on the only structure he knew, military discipline. He established a routine with rigorous precision. Chow time was at 0600 and 1800 sharp. Training commenced at 800. He treated the care of the puppies with the same seriousness he had once applied to cleaning his rifle. He scrubbed the floors, now littered with shredded newspapers and chew toys, and even repaired the fence in the backyard to create a secure perimeter. The physical labor was exhausting, leaving his muscles aching in a way that felt productive rather than punishing. The personalities of the squad began to emerge, distinct and vibrant, chipping away at the armor around Ethan's heart. Alpha, the largest female with a dark sable coat and eyes that held a fierce intelligence, naturally assumed the role of second-in-command. She was the first to master the sit command, her posture rigid and proud, and she guarded the food bowl with a low, rumbling growl that made Ethan smirk with approval. "Good girl," he would murmur, scratching behind her ears. "Hold the line." Delta, the quietest of the bunch, was the observer, sitting back and watching her siblings with a calculating gaze before joining the fray, often outsmarting them to get the best toy. Charlie, however, was the wild card. He was a lanky, awkward male whose paws seemed 2 sizes too big for his body. He was the comic relief of the unit, constantly tripping over his own feet or getting his head stuck in empty cardboard boxes. One afternoon, while Ethan was trying to fix a leak under the kitchen sink, Charlie attempted to help by stealing a wrench and running off, only to skid on a patch of water and slide comically into the refrigerator door with a soft thud and a confused yelp. Ethan, who was lying on his back under the sink, watched the scene unfold. A bubble of sound rose in his chest, unfamiliar and rusty. It started as a snort, then a chuckle, and finally erupted into a full-throated laugh that echoed off the peeling wallpaper. It was a raw, jagged sound, startling even to himself. The puppies froze, looking at him with tilted heads before rushing over to lick his face, sensing the shift in his energy. Ethan lay there on the cold linoleum, covered in dog slobber, laughing until tears pricked his eyes. Not tears of grief this time, but of release. He realized then that the silence was truly gone. The ghosts that usually haunted the corners of the room seemed to have retreated, pushed back by the sheer, unadulterated life force of these creatures. They didn't care about his medals, his trauma, or the friends he had failed. They only cared that he was there, that he was their source of food, warmth, and safety. As the weeks turned into a month, the bond deepened. They weren't just pets. They were his new squad, his fire team. He noticed the changes in himself when he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. The 1,000-yard stare was still there at times, but the edges of his eyes had softened. He had shaved the unruly beard down to a neat stubble, and he was eating regular meals again, simply because he couldn't let the troops eat alone. One evening, sitting on the back porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and gold, Ethan watched the four of them wrestling in the grass. Bravo broke away from the pack and trotted up the steps, resting his chin on Ethan's boot, looking up with those soulful survivor eyes. Ethan reached down, stroking the soft fur, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a feeling he hadn't known since before the war. He realized that in his desperate bid to save them, he had inadvertently thrown himself a lifeline. He wasn't just raising dogs, they were raising him, pulling him inch by inch out of the grave he had dug for himself. They were his redemption, covered in fur and fueled by unconditional love. The seasons had shifted, painting the leaves of the old oak tree in the backyard with strokes of burnt orange and crimson, signaling the arrival of a volatile Midwestern autumn. With the changing season came the storms, violent and brooding, rolling off the Great Lakes like invading armies. On this particular evening, the air inside the bungalow grew heavy and stagnant, charged with an electricity that made the hair on Ethan's arms stand up long before the first drop of rain fell. The four puppies, now adolescent dogs entering their gangly teenager phase with long limbs and chests that were beginning to broaden, sensed the shift immediately. They paced the living room floor, their nails clicking a nervous rhythm on the hardwood, ears swiveled back, whining low in their throats. Ethan, usually the calm anchor of the pack, felt a familiar creeping dread tighten his chest, a physiological betrayal he couldn't control. The barometer dropped, and with it, his defenses. When the first crack of thunder split the sky, it didn't sound like nature to Ethan. It sounded like a 120-millimeter mortar round impacting the earth. The flash of lightning that followed wasn't illumination. It was the muzzle flash of an enemy insurgent in a dark alley in Ramadi. In an instant, the living room in Detroit dissolved. The smell of lemon furniture polish was replaced by the acrid stench of cordite and burning rubber. The comfortable silence was shattered by the phantom screams of men he couldn't save. Ethan dropped the book he was holding, his hands flying to his ears as he scrambled backward, retreating instinctively into the corner of the room between the sofa and the wall, a defensive position his broken mind sought for cover. He curled into a tight ball, knees pulled to his chest, eyes squeezed shut but seeing only fire. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air that felt too thin to sustain him, sweat pouring down his face in cold rivulets. "Incoming! Get down!" he rasped, his voice a broken whisper lost in the thunder that shook the window panes. To an outside observer, he was a man having a panic attack. To Ethan, he was dying again. But he wasn't alone in the trench this time. The four shepherds, who had been pacing nervously, stopped. They looked at their alpha, their father, crumbling before their eyes. In the wild, weakness might invite attack, but in this pack, forged in the fires of survival and love, weakness invited protection. Alpha, the sable female who had grown into a sleek, muscular guardian with eyes that missed nothing, was the first to move. She didn't cower. She didn't run. She approached Ethan's trembling form with a purpose that defied her age. She let out a sharp bark, not of aggression, but of command, rallying her siblings. The squad moved in. They didn't need training. They had instinct, a genetic memory of service that went back generations. They formed a physical barricade between Ethan and the terrifying world outside. Alpha and Bravo, the emotional anchors, pushed their way into the small space Ethan occupied. Bravo, the survivor who knew the darkness of death intimately, whined softly and forced his head under Ethan's hands, which were clamped over his ears. He licked the salt from Ethan's cheeks, his rough tongue a grounding texture against the flashback's intangibility. Alpha pressed her entire body against Ethan's side, a solid wall of warmth and muscle, staring at the door as if daring the thunder to come closer. Meanwhile, Charlie and Delta executed a maneuver that canine therapists call deep pressure therapy, though they knew no name for it, only that it was necessary. Charlie, the heavyset male who had once been the clumsy clown, laid his 60 pounds of weight directly across Ethan's legs, anchoring him to the floor. Delta draped herself over his feet, her chin resting on his ankle, her amber eyes wide and watchful. The crushing weight of the dogs acted like a heavy blanket, slowing Ethan's racing nervous system. Slowly, agonizingly, the sensory input from the dogs began to override the hallucination. The smell of wet dog fur replaced the smell of smoke. The rhythmic thumping of Alpha's tail against the floorboards replaced the sound of gunfire. The heat radiating from their bodies pierced the cold sweat of his fear. Ethan gasped, his eyes flying open. He didn't see the desert. He saw the concerned amber gaze of Bravo inches from his face. He felt the heavy, comforting weight of Charlie on his shins. He felt the wet nose of Alpha nudge his hand. The storm still raged outside, shaking the house foundation. But the terror inside him began to recede, pushed back by the phalanx of fur and devotion surrounding him. He uncurled one hand, burying his fingers deep into Alpha's thick neck ruff. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice shaky but audible. "I'm here." The dogs didn't move. They held the perimeter. They stayed in that formation for hours, long after the thunder had rolled away to the east, a silent vigil of 4 guardians watching over the man who had once watched over them. Ethan rested his head on Bravo's flank, his breathing syncing with the slow, steady rhythm of the dog's ribcage. He realized with a profound clarity that the dynamic had shifted forever. He was no longer just their savior. Tonight, amidst the thunder and the ghosts, they had become his. They were the shield he didn't know he needed, the wall that kept the war at bay. He wasn't just a soldier with a dog. He was part of a pack, and in this pack, no one fought alone. 6 months had passed since the storm, and the world had turned on its axis, trading the biting gray of a Detroit winter for the vibrant, riotous green of early summer. The transformation in the landscape was mirrored, perhaps even surpassed, by the transformation in the man standing in the center of a fenced-in field behind his bungalow. Ethan was no longer the ghost who haunted the edges of society. He stood tall, his spine straightened by purpose rather than braced for impact, clad in a clean polo shirt with a logo embroidered on the chest, Guardian K9 Therapy. The unruly beard that had once served as a mask to hide his pain was gone, replaced by a neatly trimmed jawline that revealed a face weathered by storms but no longer eroding under them. His eyes, once hollow tunnels of grief, were now sharp and clear, scanning the field not for threats, but for progress. Around him, the squad moved with a fluid, synchronized grace that was breathtaking to behold. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta were no longer the trembling skeletons pulled from a trash heap. They were magnificent creatures, their coats gleaming like burnished copper and obsidian in the afternoon sun, their muscles rippling with kinetic energy. They sat in a perfect line, eyes locked on Ethan, waiting for the command with an intensity that spoke of absolute trust. Ethan raised a hand, palm flat. "Forward," he commanded, his voice low but carrying effortless authority. The dogs surged forward, not into chaos, but into a complex agility course designed to build confidence, not just for them, but for the men and women watching from the sidelines. Ethan had turned his pain into a blueprint. He had converted his property into a small, specialized training center dedicated to pairing rescue dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD. It was a humble beginning, just a few clients on weekends, but the impact was seismic. He watched as Charlie, the former clumsy clown of the litter, walked gently beside a young Marine who had lost his leg in Afghanistan. Charlie didn't pull or jump. He simply leaned his heavy body against the man's prosthetic, offering a silent, sturdy anchor. The Marine, whose hands had been shaking when he arrived, reached down to bury his fingers in Charlie's fur, and for the first time in an hour, his shoulders dropped. Ethan felt a familiar swell of pride, not the adrenaline-fueled pride of combat, but the slow, burning warmth of reconstruction. He had learned that you couldn't bomb trauma out of existence. You had to crowd it out with love, discipline, and connection. Delta and Bravo were working with a female medic who struggled with panic attacks, demonstrating the grounding techniques they had instinctively used on Ethan during the storm. Every success on this field was a testament to the night he chose to stop the truck and open that burlap sack. He wasn't just training dogs, he was forging keys to unlock prisons of the mind, using the very creatures that society had deemed garbage to save the heroes society had forgotten how to heal. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Detroit skyline in hues of bruised purple and molten gold, Ethan whistled, signaling the end of the day. He loaded the 4 dogs into his new van, a practical vehicle fit for a squad leader, and drove out of the city, past the familiar landmarks of his despair, until the pavement turned to gravel. The scrapyard lay before them, unchanged in its ugliness. The piles of rusted metal still twisted towards the sky like broken fingers, and the smell of oil and rot still hung heavy in the air. But as Ethan stepped out of the van, the dogs pouring out around him, the place held no power over him anymore. It was just a place, a coordinate on a map. He walked to the exact spot where he had found them, the mound of refuse now overgrown with weeds. The dogs sniffed the air, ears pricked, perhaps catching a faint ancestral memory of the cold and the hunger, but they didn't cower. They stood with their tails holding a high, confident curve. Ethan looked at them, seeing the ghosts of the dying puppies superimposed over the majestic animals they had become. He realized that this scrapyard was ground zero. It was where his old life had finally died, and his new life had drawn its first breath. He didn't feel anger towards the man in the truck anymore. In a strange twist of fate, that act of cruelty had been the catalyst for his salvation. He knelt down, the gravel biting into his jeans, and placed his hand on Alpha's broad head. She leaned into his touch, letting out a soft chuff of contentment. Bravo nudged his elbow, demanding inclusion, while Charlie and Delta sat flanking him, acting as his eternal rear guard. Ethan looked out at the setting sun, the light catching the silver in his hair and the golden flecks in the dog's eyes. He thought of his mother, and for the first time the memory didn't bring a stab of guilt, but a sense of peace. He thought of his fallen squad mates, the brothers who never came home. He had spent years trying to die with them, but now he understood that the only way to honor them was to live, truly live, for them. He had a new squad now, a squad that didn't carry rifles, but carried hope. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the air of a future he was finally ready to inhabit. He patted Alpha's side firmly, a gesture of finality and beginning. "Let's go home, squad," he whispered to the wind, a smile touching his lips. Mission accomplished. Sometimes the greatest miracles in life do not arrive with thunder or fanfare, but in the quiet, desperate moments when we choose to stop and care. Ethan thought he was saving 4 helpless puppies from a trash heap, but in truth, God was sending him the very angels he needed to save himself. We all face storms that threaten to break us, and we all carry burdens that feel too heavy to bear, yet we must remember that we are never truly walking alone. Redemption is always waiting, often hidden in the eyes of those who need us most. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a reminder that second chances are real. Leave a comment below about your own miracles and subscribe to our channel to join this family of hope. May God bless you and keep you safe until we meet again.